Welcome to the Gravity Well podcast with me, Jenny Yeremy. I host the Gravity Well to celebrate and share the stories of people looking to empower others with the knowledge and skills required to reestablish stability in our communities. My mission is to work through heavy issues in conversation and process in order to lighten the load. I acknowledge that I live on the traditional territories of Treaty 7 and Métis Districts 5 and 6. The treaties and self-governance agreements established by Indigenous peoples were created to honor the laws of the land, maintain balance with nature, and give back to uphold reciprocal relationships. This knowledge and intention are what guide the Gravity Well conversations. I ask for genuine dialogue, real hearts, and openness to different perspectives. This is your invitation to find common ground with me. Positions taken by participants, either individually or collectively, do not necessarily represent those of the Gravity Well. This podcast is dedicated to the natural world, our children, nieces, nephews, grandchildren, and all future generations. The Gravity Well is on YouTube and streaming wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you see and hear, remember to like and subscribe.
Welcome to the studio, Wesam. I'm thrilled to have you back here. This is our fourth conversation we were just discussing before we got going here. Lots to talk about. It's only been 2 months since we last spoke, but let's start with just a reintroduction of yourself, please, Wesam, for folks, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. Thanks, Jenny. My name is Wesam Cooley. I'm a local activist in Calgary. I've been one of the leading organizers for the rallies against the ongoing genocide in Gaza, which has now expanded to, I'd say, a broader genocide across much of West Asia. And I'm also the co-founder of the Calgary People's Assembly.
Yeah, can't remember which person said it, but they were talking about how Lebanon does not have this supposed story of this long history that needs to be sorted. So yes, this genocide has expanded into places that are very obviously were never justified, but obviously not stopping where the story ended. Thank you for being here. Lots to talk about, so let's get after it. Okay, so last we spoke, there was a claim of a ceasefire. Maybe I'll let you, please, Wesam, can you help people understand what happened with the negotiations, the ceasefire, and where we're at today in that respect, please?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are allegedly 2 ceasefires now involving Israel, one in Gaza and one in Lebanon. And in both cases, the ceasefire hasn't been respected by Israel for basically even a single day. In Lebanon, Israel continues to bomb towns and villages in the south. We've seen over the course of this, they were also bombing places further north like Beirut, who received some heavy bombing a few weeks ago. The stats I've seen, and these may change, but I've seen it said that over 2,500 people have been killed in Lebanon since March. This is all in the time that's supposedly been covered by a ceasefire. It continues even today. You can see daily headlines, and some of it actually has been started to seep into the Western headlines. There was a desecration of a statue of Jesus in southern Lebanon by some Israeli soldiers, which got some international attention because, any number of dead Arabs is whatever, but, you desecrate a statue of Jesus, and that gets, that's what gets the Western headlines. Of course, it's a horrendous crime against the Christian community of Lebanon in any case. So that's Lebanon, that's the Israeli army there. And then obviously in Gaza, the killing hasn't stopped either. There have been hundreds killed since the supposed ceasefire. Again, in Gaza, Hamas and the other resistance factions have actually stopped firing on Israel. There haven't been, to my knowledge, any incidents at all there, even though Israel hasn't respected the ceasefire at all. And Israel continues its ethnic cleansing operations in the West Bank. There's almost daily videos there's all kinds of horrors that you see. Just the other day, I saw a video, I believe it was from somewhere in Palestine, of an Israeli settler attacking a nun, just an old woman walking in the street alone. Settler comes up behind her and just shoves her to the ground and comes back and starts kicking her. This is like almost a daily occurrence. It's a daily occurrence. Now we're starting to see a daily occurrence being videos of this being shared as well, which is somewhat new. This history's been going on for decades, but now, at least the world is starting to pay attention to this stuff.
Yes. Yeah. That's the thing. Like, you're right. I saw my son actually forwarded me a CNN video of that nun being pushed down. And I think it was in the West Bank. And yeah, and he took like several steps away. Like, I'm talking like 20 feet away, and then decided to go back and kick her some more in view of the public. There was somebody who just casually walked by this incident. It's just unbelievable. And you're right. It's, I think about the Me Too movement and the spectrum of crimes on it. And you're talking about this desecration of a statue symbol, a Christian symbol. Of course, it's horrible. And I'm glad that people recognize that this is something that is very unusual and scary to see. But of course, it's not, pales in comparison to the ongoing genocide that's expanding for the Greater Israel Project, if you will. So let's move on from there. Let's talk about what's happening in the other Gulf states, please. Can you help people understand? I know there's been some mainstream sharing. I think the Wall Street Journal highlighted that they showed some of the wreckage in places like the UAE and in Bahrain and Kuwait and Qatar a little. Nothing out of Israel, interestingly, but some information, at least from that regard. Can we talk about that a bit, please?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I want to just preface this with there is a lot of fog of war at the moment. It's really tough to tell what is actually happening on the ground, because there are reports going around that Iran has been firing on the UAE, but Iran has been denying it. So this would not be the first time that attacks on one of these Gulf countries were attributed to Iran, but actually came from Israel. I believe there were some attacks in the early days of this war with Iran on Saudi Arabia that were actually from Israel, and it was Israel trying to stoke Saudi into a further commitment to confrontation with Iran. So it's complicated, and I certainly don't have any sources on the ground that have any information about any of this that I can speak to, but what is happening is Iran is denying it. So make of that what you will. That said, there is a conflict here. It's maybe a sign of things that may be yet to come, and things that we have seen, because we did see Iran launch attacks on U.S. military bases in these regions, and Iran has threatened openly. It has said, if the U.S. goes back to war with Iran and starts hitting Iranian infrastructure again, then it'll start hitting infrastructure in these countries. So it's not something Iran hasn't threatened to do, but at the moment, without open hostilities with the Americans, Iran is saying we're not doing those kinds of things. Iran is very careful to make sure that it is abiding by the terms of any agreements or ceasefires that it agrees to, which is remarkable, because the Americans and the Israelis have no respect for any of these things and could attack Iran at a moment's notice without hesitation or scruple. So, just a reflection. I tend to favor Iran's word on these things, because it has proven to be a pretty credible in its statements so far. I'd say for most of the resistance, this applies. They tend not to lie. They tend to tell the truth.
When you're playing a long game, it seems like telling the truth is the best way to go about it. Yes, and they definitely have been playing a very long game here. This has been 47 years of trying to understand. Just from an oil and gas perspective, I just want to remind people, I think it's the UAE has lost 50% of its production. This is historic now. This was in the early conflicts, as you were saying. The recent events, I fully appreciate, are not being taken ownership by Iran, but the early stage ones and the sort of back and forth, Israel or the US would strike, Iran would respond in those initial efforts. There's a lot of production that has come offline. I've read it, or I watched a recent video, which I will share with this conversation, around 14 million barrels a day that's been removed from the system. That is bringing us back to 2011 levels in terms of our production and the world system as well. We're expected to see in the next couple of weeks the effects of that to start taking place. So all of these tankers that were held at the Strait of Hormuz, which are now been rerouted, have met their destination, and they are now empty. And we are looking at seeing the effects of this take hold. So this is not, I heard somebody say today, there's no normal going back from this. We have already gone off of a cliff. And I was joking about the potential title of this conversation today being The Love Boat, the Strait of Hormuz edition. We need to figure out how to come together as Canadians and Iranians and the people of Lebanon and the greater Gulf region and the Americas, et cetera, and figure out how to get ourselves working in the right direction, because this is not ending. This is not, even if there is no aggression, which there's been evidence of the US having more supplies there. Again, this is coming. I get my information, and Wesam, you could please help people understand where you do get your information when I stop talking here. But that there's new supply coming from the US. This is coming from former military advisors, CIA operatives, Colonel Wilkerson, Scott Ritter, Larry Johnson, these names. Larry Johnson was actually in Calgary recently advising, I suspect, oil and gas executives on what's gone on here, remembering that Canada does require some foreign oil to operate here. We don't have ready-made product because we export it all to the States for them to make more on it than us. So lots of moving parts. And the last thing I'll close on this whole energy section is just this video I was just talking about, this expert saying that they need to lean on places like Alberta and places like Venezuela to make up for these lost volumes. That's not happening in short order, and certainly not with our freshwater in mind. So we're in a major turning point here. And I know, Wesam, you often help us see our way through these tumultuous times, but can you offer some thoughts on all of that, just the energy story and what you're picturing in terms of where we're headed and where we're at today?
Yeah, well, a big part of the energy story is already hitting us. If any of you have been at the pumps lately, this is the beginning of what's coming. Bear that in mind. This is the beginning. And even if there's an agreement now, if this afternoon the Americans and Iranians agree to a complete cessation of hostilities, which is a bit of a pipe dream, but even if that were to happen, we've already locked in quite a bit of future economic downturn, which is inevitable at this point, even if everything were to stop, right? And that's without including the possibility of a resumption of hostilities and more disruption to the global oil flow. So it is very difficult and complicated. There is going to be leaning on Venezuela and Alberta, and I don't think they care about the water or anything else, right? They're going to ram this through one way or the other. They're going to get their way the way that they always do, because that's what ruling class is. They're a bunch of elites who will, by hook or by crook, make sure that their profits remain flowing and that their system remains stable. And so, we've spoken before about the way that Albertan separatism fits into this. Obviously, I don't want to get too far down that rabbit hole here. We've seen in the last few weeks a lot of news on that front. The petition has now been submitted. So, I guess there are enough people who totally legitimately signed that petition. I used to, driving around the last few weeks, I saw some of these little tables out on the side of the roads, right? And just a handful of people. Yeah, there's no one.
0 people signing, just 2 people sadly standing with flags.
Yeah.
Yet somehow they've got over 300,000 signatures.
Yeah. It's remarkable, right? It's amazing. It's incredible. It makes you wonder, oh my goodness, if there's that many people who are secretly committed to separatism, will these people turn out at the referendum as well? Will all of these phantom votes and signatures turn out at the referendum? And bear in mind the way that regime change works, which those of the rest of the world know very well. They don't actually have to win a referendum really what they need to do is create a crisis that justifies some kind of a forceful intervention. And my understanding is a lot of these folks who were involved in the trucker movement around COVID, those folks who were over terrorizing the border in Ottawa and who were disrupting a lot of everyday, living because they didn't like masks and vaccines and all of that, a lot of them have sort of reared their heads around this separatism thing. So, and you got to remember what Trump did when he lost the election in 2020, right? You'll recall he declared this election was stolen, and a whole bunch of really fanatical white supremacists stormed the Capitol building. And who knows what they might have done if things had gone differently that day. So, do they need to win a referendum in Alberta? No. But they do, what happens if they declare that it was stolen after they lose? And there's enough crazy truckers who are willing to cause a disruption. That kind of political crisis can be very dangerous. And out of something like that, it's kind of like what they did in Iran when they had Mossad running around stoking these revolutions and then trying to justify their own intervention there. If what they're after is the oil, right?
Yeah, well, and Mike Pompeo, who just bragged about this, doing just this, we spoke about this in our last conversation, is planned to do a presentation with our premier. I think it's either tomorrow or Friday, with the Canada Strong and Free Network, as I was just speaking about with my friend Mikayla. So yeah, the circles just go round and round, and it's becoming very clear that Alberta is I'm taking some Indigenous worldview education at the moment, just a very casual discussion, but very, very well done. And we were talking about is Canada an occupying nation? Like, do we occupy? And I would say yes, we are doing that in places like South America, and I don't know about Africa, but certainly South America. But also, I said we are an occupied state. It's very clear that we are. Also, that's really, when I think about, you and I've spoken about the Ukrainian war and sort of my awakening around it a little. Anyway, it's still coming in. We've got to talk about Ukraine at some point. Wesam, sorry, I keep saying your name wrong. It's going to happen eventually. But that we brought the conflicts. Like, I was taught in the industry that we just have to deal with this local corruption. No, we got in there by finding the corrupt ways of accessing resources and extracting it from places. So it's just it's a lot to realize that we are both an aggressor and being occupied, like I say, in this province. I don't know about the rest of the country, but I certainly think it must be the case. So it's big stuff. And like I said, so we got to somehow talk about what comes next. Like, I just heard, I think it was Scott Ritter saying this 10-point plan, or maybe now it's a 14-point plan. And let's talk a bit about how Iran is trying to communicate with us, if you will. You've already talked about their desire to be honest and to be clear and to be, for the record, I'm a strong advocate of that, is at least put on the record what you know to be true and the way that things can be proven to be so. Talk a bit about how they're trying to communicate with us. And that's where I'm getting into this whole love boat concept, because we got to start thinking about ourselves as one and pushing back against these forces. So yeah, can you talk about this 10-point plan and what that means in terms of where we're moving forward as a people?
Yeah, so the way it worked was the United States put forward a framework for negotiations, which I believe was the original 14-point plan, and Iran rejected that. This was when they were in the middle of hostilities after the U.S. made, an aggression against Iran, and then realized how much firepower Iran actually had, and then started backtracking. Then Iran put forward a 10-point proposal, which was to be the starting point for negotiations, and Trump accepted that as a starting point. And that's been the basis on which these negotiations and the ceasefire have sort of happened so far. There's been very little progress in terms of negotiations, because they went to these negotiations, you may remember, in Pakistan. And once they got there, it became very clear to everybody, including the Iranians and the Pakistanis, that the Americans had no intention of actually seriously negotiating on the basis of these these points they agreed with Iran. Quite reasonable points, by the way. Iran saying we need a guarantee that this is never going to happen again. You're never going to attack us again. We want you to pay reparations for the damages you've done, new security infrastructure for the region. You know, pretty sensible things from the perspective of a country that's just been attacked. And the Americans are really just totally, America's in a real bind. It isn't able to defeat Iran, or if it were to try to, it would be at enormous cost to itself and to the global economy, which it's just not prepared to do. But it also isn't really in a place where it can accept peace with Iran, because for two main reasons. One is the fact that the United States knows that if Iran were to succeed, it has now achieved basically a sort of global superpower status, and there's no indication that Iran is actually going to give up now its hold over the Strait of Hormuz, which it always had the right, you know, to assert and just never did before this point. But, you know, they're going to be charging a toll now, and anyone trying to go through the strait that's supporting military action against Iran isn't going to be allowed to, basically, is what Iran's saying. And the United States is now finding itself in a conundrum where it's like maybe going to be unable, it's opened Pandora's box here, and it's unable to turn back time. And that's the situation that they're trying to avoid, because the U.S. is built upon this global exploitation. They can't accept a new framework in the Middle East. It's going to put them and their allies in the Middle East in a really bad position, which brings me to the second reason why they can't make an agreement, which is Israel. Israel, since Operation Al-Aqsa Flood on October 7th, has been in a situation, it's been in essentially a death spiral. It has been demonstrated by Hamas and these ragtag resistance fighters from Gaza that its military might has been a bit of a paper tiger. That's been demonstrated again and again now since then by Hezbollah and by Iran and by Yemen, who have all dealt enormous blows to this occupying state. Israel, in response, has been just breathing fire upon the entire region. We saw what it did in Gaza, which it's still doing, saw what it's been doing in the West Bank. In Lebanon now, it's expanded, and we're seeing attacks and bloodshed in Lebanon, the likes of which we've rarely ever seen on this kind of a scale and in this rapidly.
1,000-year-old communities just blown to bits. Like this is history being erased in minutes. Sorry to interrupt. Keep going.
No, please feel free to interrupt at any point. I tend to go on, but you know, so that this is. People see that, and some people might mistake this as like, oh, Israel's very strong and therefore it's able to carry out all this destruction. And I really want to stress to people, this is not a sign of strength. This is a sign of weakness by Israel. Israel is cornered, and it has no other idea of what to do other than to lash out and you know, just unleash its wrath upon anyone it can find. But this is a response to the fact that, like, they are desperate. I mean, why are they really in Lebanon? They want to destroy the resistance, and they find there, just like in Gaza, they committed this genocide in Gaza for 2.5 years and massacred enormous numbers of people, blew up hospitals and schools and filled mass graves with, you know, innocent civilian bodies, and they did all of this. But the one thing they couldn't do was disarm the resistance, because they aren't actually, the Israelis and the Americans, I'd argue, have no actual ability militarily to do anything other than murder basically women and children. But when it comes to actually fighting real fighters in a fair fight on a battleground, they have been outmatched not only by Iran, clearly, but even by the resistance in Hezbollah, and even by those, you know, those orphans of the last generation in Gaza. These fighters who literally are in tunnels for months, for years now, living in tunnels, working with entirely domestically homemade military hardware. You know, just they come out of these tunnels in flip-flops and sweatpants, and they've been able to militarily hold back and prevent the resistance from being disarmed, and the same in Lebanon. So all Israel is able to do now is just inflict such a huge toll on the populations of these places, in the hopes that these populations will then turn around to their own resistance and say, hey, you know, stop doing this. It's costing us too much. But they don't. It has the opposite effect. You see these people then, you know, double down on their support for the resistance, because they understand we need to get these genocidal settlers out of this place. We cannot tolerate this state anymore. And Iran and all of the resistance has opened up now a door where people can see a future in the coming years where there's no more Israel in the Middle East. I mean, that is a future that we all kind of dreamed of, but never thought it would be a reality that we'd live to see. And now we're watching its collapse in real time.
Yeah, and to hear people like Larry Wilkerson say, just 6 months ago, this is never going to happen. Like, for example, like the Chinese dollar coming into play,
Right.
that's years away, that's decades away. It's happening now. Like he said, I never thought I'd see the fall of Israel. I'm seeing it. I think the other thing that like you touched on, and I'm going to expand on, is the US has also shown it's a paper tiger in this as well. I know one of the levers they were hoping to use was to choke off other areas, similar to what Iran has the capacity to do for here. But I just learned from Scott Ritter today, I think it was, that China could cut off Taiwan very easily. That's what this has helped show, that, is Iran just basically gave China a playbook for what to do if this started to happen in the US. Not to say that the US has the resources for that. The other thing that Scott Ritter said that I need to say is the people on the ground know the real story, right? That's what Scott is saying. Follow the data, follow the people that are on the ground, follow the actual movement of materials, the advancement of more military supply, let's say, from the US in the region. But I look at that from my perspective, again, from energy, is the same is true in our case. This whole iceberg of ignorance logic from these leaders thinking that Alberta and Venezuela can make up for it. Again, I know it's their plan. I know it's what they want to do, but the reality of the situation is really quite different on the time scale and the capacity and the space with wastewater and things like that. That's just, all things are coming to a head in the same way. So, and the other thing I just wanted to add in was now it looks like the UAE is joining Israel in its fall potentially. It's I don't know if you can explain it better there, but it seems like, it's leaving OPEC and that it seems like a sort of a last ditch effort when they're potentially on the brinks of losing production. Any thoughts on that piece with UAE?
Yeah, I mean, the UAE has been in dire straits since the very beginning of this war. Look, there's a lot of, I think there's going to be a lot of redrawing of the borders and states of West Asia at the end of this war. And there are a few places that I think probably don't survive this period of history. Israel's one of them, and the Emirates are another, and perhaps some of the other Gulf states as well. I mean, the Emirates is already like an artificial creation of Western governments and capital that essentially is like a slave plantation committed to, I guess, a slave oil extractor in the desert, which is not really a place where you would normally have this kind of population. Its working class is almost entirely migrant labor, very poorly treated, very horrendous conditions there, and like democratic rights aren't a thing. Right? They don't exist in these countries, and that's necessary because that's how you enslave an entirely migrant population and prevent them from rising up. There have been efforts at some kinds of strikes and uprisings in some of these Gulf countries in the past, and they just get brutally destroyed. I mean, Saudi Arabia regularly beheads people, right? Like these are our allies, right? These are Canada's allies in the region, right? Iran is the bad guy, but Saudi Arabia, which has regular beheadings and didn't allow women to drive until just a few years ago, these are our friends who we send, all kinds of weapons to. But the Emirates is really, I mean, the Emirates came under a lot of bombardment from Iran in that earlier period of hostilities. And a lot of the foreign, the influencers and the foreign capital and the people who come from the West, the expats, so-called, to go and live a comfortable life in this desert paradise, when they realized at that moment that, oh, we're actually living like in a pseudo war zone, which could break out into war at any moment, a lot of them just started leaving. And a lot of the people I've been watching are saying, like, yeah, this Dubai model, where you can have this, is just a thing of the past now, because once missiles have fallen in that space, no longer can you have that. And so the UAE is in a real crisis. it might not persist. There's talk already of like some of its neighbors even maybe gobbling up some of its territory, because again, these borders were already drawn by white colonialists, right? There's some claims that maybe historically would have been resolved differently if not for these Western guns being pointed in various directions at various borders. So a country like the UAE expect some, some karma for past sins coming due with not just the UAE, but with a lot of these Western subordinate states.
Yeah, in our the last rally I was at with you, you were talking about the world wars, and I was thinking afterwards, Wesam, the idea of a trilogy, like a movie trilogy. Usually, the second of the trilogy is horrifying, and the third one can be good. Like this is where we're at. Is maybe if you could, because I know that was new information to me. Could you elaborate a bit on that, your logic around this being similar to the World War I place we were?
Sure. Yeah, I think I remember the speech you're referring to. Yeah, like I mean, I think we have to view all of this history as a continuum. Yeah, let me know if you want me to continue there.
No, sorry,
Yeah.
that was just yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, sure, no worries. Yeah, I think this is one continuum, and I think it has to be viewed through the lens of capitalist imperialism and what I view as like the struggle between capitalism and socialism. I am a Marxist. I make no secret of that, right? And I think that this is a defining feature of our history. So you have like a whole European history where Europe is basically at war with themselves, a lot of fighting internally in Europe, and that kind of a lot of that gets temporarily pushed into the rest of the world, where Europe then decides we'll have peace at home and colonize the rest of the world instead. And that's when you have first, Spain and Portugal go and literally draw lines on the world map and say everything here is Spain's and everything here is Portugal's. And then eventually Britain and France come and kind of take their place. A lot of wars between Britain and Spain over colonial holdings, also wars between Britain and France over colonial holdings. And then Germany comes onto the world scene a little bit late and has this massive military power at home that it builds up, and finds though that all of the colonies are taken. And there's this big conference in Berlin led by Otto von Bismarck, where they literally, the Berlin Conference, you may know, where the powers of Europe sit on a map of Africa and draw up the lines of where the territories are. Okay, this belongs to Britain, this belongs to France, this belongs to Italy, this belongs to Germany, and then literally draw lines all across and form the modern boundaries of Africa. And that's why if you open up a map of Africa today, there are straight lines all over the place, right? If you look at Europe, there's squiggly lines everywhere, because these are lines that follow a sort of history of, organically being blurs. Yeah. Whereas in Africa, it's literally just a lot of lines, right? A lot of straight lines, right? So, but, Germany shows up late. The whole world's colonies have been divided between themselves. And Germany says, well, we actually have a stronger military industrial base than Britain and France. We have certainly more than the share that's reflected in our control of the rest of the world. And we want more. We want more of the world. It's not fair that Britain and France are the only ones who have this colonial control of all of these places. And that tension erupts into world war. And that is where the origin of World War I is. The colonial powers formed their alliances with each other. Germany is the one that's late to the scene, but has incredible military capacity, and decides, we're going to fight for it. And then we know the results of that. But something very interesting happens at the end of World War I. There's a revolution in Russia, which pulls the Russians out of the war and which sends a wave of terror across all of these colonial powers, because this is a workers' and peasants' revolution. The notion that workers, that average people and peasants could ever be a force in history was just never taken seriously by any of these powers. It was like a pipe dream. Marxism had been around, but it was never really taken that seriously. Suddenly you have a revolution spring up in the middle of this war. And the war ends a few years later. Germany is punished for, its sins, being on the losing end, even though, Germany is as bad as the others, but it didn't deserve, what it got at the end of World War I, right? Which ends up coming back to haunt these powers. But shortly after World War I, 14 capitalist nations invade Russia. This is a part of the history that's hardly ever talked about. Britain, France, Germany, the United States, Canada, I mean, forces that were on opposing sides in World War I, all came together to try and put an end to this workers' and peasant revolution in Russia. And they failed. The Russian people withstood them. And from that point on, these were an enormous enemy of the West, right? And they immediately sided with all the colonized, oppressed peoples of the world. I mean, one of the first acts that Lenin took as the new head in Russia was to declare freedom for all of the Russian colonies. I mean, what kind of, can you imagine? I mean, these were like, the Russian Empire was a significant, large empire. And immediately they said, all of these nations are freed. You're all free. And if you'd like, you're welcome to join us in a union if you want to, as free nations. Some of them decided not to, but some of them did. And that's what becomes this Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It's these a dozen or so republics that all, or actually it's more than that, right? But they all, you know, countries like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, you know, these countries that were, you know, Uzbekistan, these countries that were the colonized, oppressed peoples of the Russian Empire, are welcomed into a republic of Soviet socialist, you know, allies and equals. And from that point on, develop a really remarkable, rapid development. Literacy rates skyrocket. Women are given the right to vote immediately, which also triggers, you know, women's votes being extended across much of the rest of the world. Because if Russia's got them, you can't justify not having them anymore. This is it's a part of the history that's not taught. And obviously they immediately started siding with the colonies everywhere. Africa needs to be decolonized. We support African revolution. We support resistance elsewhere. And the powers of Europe and the West hated this. They hated this. And meanwhile, Germany, which had been screwed over at the end of World War I, as we know, saw the rise of this Nazi movement, which was viciously, I mean, violent, very angry about the history of what had been done to Germany after World War I, but also extremely violently anti-communist. There were communists in Germany, and there was a sizable attempt at a communist revolution in Germany, but it was violently crushed with the support of the liberals and the social democrats who, you know, effectively allowed the fascists to literally murder some of the leading communists in Germany. I mean, you may know the name Rosa Luxemburg. She was a major writer, socialist, she's German.
I follow the Rosa Luxemburg Institute's Organizing for Power.
They're great. They're great. They're excellent. And she was part of this organizing in Germany, and she was murdered. She was murdered with the collaboration of the Social Democrats by fascists in Germany. And a German attempt at a socialist revolution was defeated. And Russia, the Soviet Union after that, kind of found itself isolated in Europe. And then World War II happens. And, you know, there was a pact between Stalin and Hitler, which a lot of bourgeois historians make a big deal about this pact. But what's not talked about is the fact that Germany signed many non-aggression pacts with Western countries first. For a lot of this history, Stalin was raising alarm bells to the West, saying, are you going to allow this? Are you just going to allow this Hitler menace to rise and not do anything about it? Can we start talking about how we confront this? But instead, you know, across the Western world, you're seeing deals and a lot of there were massive Nazi rallies in the United States and in Britain. So there was a lot of sympathy for this Nazism. A lot of people who were like, yeah, let's go kill those Russians. Let's go kill the communists. Let's get rid of the Jews in our countries. I mean, there was a lot of, remember what these countries are built on: racism, exploitation, capitalism, white supremacy, right? So there's a lot of sympathy for Nazi Germany, but
you can't have capitalism without racism. I've got my husband found that sign for me recently. Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, keep going.
No, yeah. Malcolm X said the same. I think Martin Luther King also towards the end of his life was coming to the same kind of conclusions. It's the truth. You know, the Nazis end up going to war on Europe. They have these delusions that they can just basically do to Europe what Europe's been doing to the rest of the world. It's remarkable. You colonize Africa, colonize North America. The Germans say, well, why can't we just colonize France and Poland and Russia? That's how it works. We need living space, right? Lebensraum, that's living space, which is the same thing that they built here. You needed to expand to send your settlers here, right? You need living space. And Hitler says it himself. He's like, I'm inspired by what the Americans did in North America. This is the inspiration for this project. He starts out, there's very little resistance on the Western Front. France falls very quickly. And then there's a lot of discussions between the Soviet Union. Well, Hitler then turns east to the Russians before he tries to cross into Britain or anything like that. He then invades Russia, which was a bit of a disaster for him, because then the Russians talk to the Brits and the Americans, and basically at that point they form an alliance where Russia then is at war with Germany, and Germany, overwhelmingly, its casualties were on the Eastern Front. Russia sacrifices 20 million of its citizens, and another 20 or 30 million Chinese lost their lives also fighting the Japanese. So the communists really were the biggest fighters on the Allied side during World War II. It's not really a history that's talked about. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, you're right. I got to soak on that. That's interesting.
Yeah. There's actually a really good film. I believe it's called When Lions Roared, about the diplomatic discussions between Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. And Michael Caine is in it, and Michael Caine plays Stalin, and he just steals the show. It's my favorite Michael Caine performance. Yeah.
Oh my God, wonderful. I have to watch this.
It's fantastic. Wow. And I don't think it's not actually particularly biased in one direction or the other, but it's it gives the Soviet Union a fair representation, I think, and there's a scene in it which is remarkable where it has Stalin, and this has actually happened, right, where Stalin is complaining to Britain and the United States that they're taking too long opening up a Western Front. He's saying, why don't you land? Why don't you invade France? All of the German army is in the east here, fighting us, destroying us, besieging us. We're losing tens of millions here. Why aren't you opening up a Western Front? Why is it taking you so long? And, the film doesn't really depict this, but I mean, Winston Churchill was a rabid anti-communist, and they were more than happy to watch the Germans march east. They were more than happy. They were hoping Hitler would take down the Soviet Union first, and then they could deal with them. But miraculously, the Soviets fought back the Germans and then started a counteroffensive and actually started marching into Germany. And that's the moment when the landing at Normandy comes. Okay, that's the moment when the landing comes, not to defeat the Germans and to take the pressure off of the Russians, but the moment the Soviets turn the tides and start marching, that's when the landing comes, so that Western capitalist forces can make their way to Berlin so it doesn't go 100% communist. And guess what they do? They end up splitting Germany and splitting Berlin. So for most of the Cold War, you have an East and West Germany and East and West Berlin. Okay, and this is this, right?
That is so fascinating. I think about I was so pleased to hear this because I've been saying it myself, the parallels between today and, this was Larry Wilkerson saying, the Star Wars story. And bear with me for a second, because it's like the line in the first movie where he says, these aren't the droids you're looking for. Right. And then they go, oh, these aren't the droids. Never mind. And that's what communism is, right? Like it's this, oh, we hate that. We hate that. We don't look at it. We don't talk about it. It's the enemy. Yeah. And in fact, it's the enemy today. Like that's what separatism is being fueled around. We're trying to kill this communist movement. Like it is not gone away. This revolution has an opportunity to reconvene today, is essentially how I took the away your thoughts when you were speaking to us last. Is that fair, Wesam?
Yeah.
Is that what you said?
Yeah, I mean, look, this doesn't end until the capitalist system ends. This constant, incessant need to expand exploitation, this is what's at the heart of it, right? Even after the Soviets won, there's a whole era of the Cold War where what is that era defined by? The Korean War, the Vietnam War, the massacring of communists and popular forces from the African continent to Latin America, with the Pinochet coup, to the Middle East and all of the horrors that have been inflicted on the Palestinian people. All of that is, within a context of an imperialist system that does not end until we have people's revolutions. And this is the key thing that I try to drive home to Westerners, is that like we are comfortable here only because these Western nations are the place where a sort of unholy bargain, an evil contract has been signed, where a section of the workers are promised the benefits of empire in return for stability here. Don't make revolution here. Don't talk about revolution here. The best you're able to do, is like union organizing. I mean, look, I support the teachers. I support the nurses' strikes. I support the postal workers and the airport workers and all that. I support them 100%. But these are struggles. So for the proceeds of empire to be shared more equitably here. That's what those are. It's they haven't transformed into struggles to change the structure of the entire system. And that's until we have that, we're not going to see it. And it's always going to blow back on us. None of us are safe until all of us are safe. This is a key thing I want to drive home. Just look at it today. Go look at your oil prices and see how safe you are from the turbulence of the rest of the world. It's an illusion that there's this division, but it's the people here that make themselves, and even like leftists and progressives who make themselves willing accomplices to this by treating things like Palestine as secondary, by treating these histories as just kind of history that we don't need to take too seriously. But look, you have your countries which are still arming Israel. The Canadian government is still. They just had this bill go through the Canadian Parliament maybe a couple months ago now. The No More Loopholes bill. You may have heard of this. Yeah. A lot of activists campaigned very hard on this for many months, where they were basically trying to get a bill to say the Canadian government on the books has laws that say you can't export weapons to Israel because of the war crimes it's committing. That's the law as it stands. But there's a loophole whereby if they sell to the United States, companies that sell to the United States can still have their weapons effectively sold to Israel because they go through the United States without this regulation and go on to Israel. So this bill would have just patched up that loophole, just to say this loophole needs to be, just to apply the law as it actually is. Over 90% of parliamentarians voted it down. Over 90% of our parliament voted it down. If you don't think we need a revolution here, then you're just not paying attention.
Yeah. Well, and like you said, this is how it has to happen. And it's only like the history books show us this, but also all of those past errors that you were describing, the post-World War I, post-World II errors, they've mounted. And now we have to address them all as one, like you're saying, to understand that we are a part of this. I want to offer a quote from Kevin Van Teekum, who's a biologist or ecologist, excuse me, but he's somebody I pay close attention to in the work I'm doing. But it's actually Robert McFarlane, who's a writer in Alberta, said, "Despair is an indulgence. Hope is a discipline." And I think why I'm bringing that into this is because it's a luxury to be in despair. It's a luxury to be, somebody else will deal with that. Palestine doesn't mean anything to me. All of those things are the indulgence that we're giving into and not recognizing ourselves in it. When I say myself as a Westerner, and instead, it does take discipline to be hopeful and to have to suffer through the pain of witnessing and discussing these these atrocities and being a part of this history. I think of the way that we think about the end of World War II and how we've assigned Russia to this story, even though it was Germany that was carrying this out, and that it wasn't, the lack of stopping it from the West earlier on is something that has become more apparent to me over the more recent years here too. So yeah, it's fascinating to look at this story being still playing out today, and our responsibility to come together in these conversations and figure out our way through it. I will plug for your community and mine, May 29th is the first day of action happening on a work day in Alberta. It's the first example following the No Kings rally in the States, understanding that we have to now make it structural, like you're saying, Wesam. We have to make sure that we're not that we're making it difficult to continue the system as it's going and being willing to take some sacrifices. The leader of that, the Alberta Federation of Labor leader, I'll plug, you should watch his conversation on the Breakdown Alberta. He says he's willing to go to jail. This is where we're at. We're at a place where we have to be willing to take some serious chances and appreciate that it's now or never. So what did I miss? What do you want to hit on before we wrap? Wesam, anything?
Sure.
Folks?
Yeah, I'll just say a few closing things. I mean, there was a statement that went out. I can't remember who I saw saying it, but pointing out that, Iran has kind of dealt a real blow to the empire by closing the Strait of Hormuz. And the point they made, the way they put it was, there are Straits of Hormuz everywhere. Find the Strait of Hormuz equivalent in your area and block it and do what you can to send that message, right? And there are, I mean,
rebel forces. If we're using the Star Wars parallel, we got to think of ourselves as rebel forces. We got to stop the continuation. Oh, that's brilliant. Sorry, keep going.
No, yeah. We have to be finding these ways also to inspire people. There is a lot of pessimism, but I just want to stress, you asked earlier about how Iran talks to the rest of the world and this love boat analogy, and how do we connect with those people? There was a moment during the war, like during the open hostilities, when the US was bombing Iran, where Trump threatened to bomb the power plants and bridges of Iran. You may remember this. And he made this big threat. He's like, we're gonna, you know how he does on Twitter. He's, thank you for your attention.
Everything.
Yeah. And he particularly threatened the power plants and bridges. And citizens of Iran went to the bridges and the power plants. I remember seeing one of these videos from this bridge where they just packed the bridge with their bodies, just as citizens, and said, come for us, Trump, come at us, Emperor. We're not afraid of you, and we'll defend these bridges with our bare bodies if we have to. That's the kind of spirit that exists among these
resolve. Yeah. Under pressure. Wow.
And that's what I dream to see also from the Western left. And there have been examples of this. I'll maybe end with this story. I actually spent a month in the People's Republic of China just recently. I returned from there about a week ago, and spent quite a few of my days there in the Communist Party Museum, which is a remarkable, massive building, 4 floors, just going through the whole history in depth. I was there for 3 full days, and I didn't even see everything, right? But some of your viewers may know the name Norman Bethune, maybe not. He was a Canadian doctor, a member of the Communist Party of Canada, who went to China during the revolution and offered his services to help heal guerrilla fighters during the Revolutionary War. And he is so renowned in China. The Communist Party Museum had a massive portrait just of him. They had a whole section on foreign volunteers, and they had a portrait just on him. And I was really touched. At the end of the section about the revolution, that historical section, they have a wall where they have the list of 100 names of people who made particularly notable contributions to the revolution. And Bethune, by the way, ended up dying in this war. He contracted blood poisoning while working there, and Mao Zedong wrote a whole article about him and thanking his revolutionary international spirit. So they have this wall with a list of 100 people who made big contributions to the revolution. There's tens of millions of names that could be on this, mostly Chinese people who lost their lives, right? And in this 100 names, they have Norman Bethune, a Canadian doctor who went there to give his life, in the Communist Party Museum in the middle of Beijing. It's not even in English, and it's not for us. I talked to a Chinese friend I met there, and he was like, every high school student in China learns the name Norman Bethune. So, Canadians, there's very few moments which I've really felt proud to be Canadian in my life, and that is certainly the most proud I've ever felt to be a Canadian, is to know that this heroic member of the Communist Party sacrificed his life and is today cherished by the Chinese people in a way that his own country, people here don't even know his name, right? But that's the kind of spirit of internationalism we need to build.
Yeah, that's amazing. And yeah, I feel it coming. I don't know if I mentioned this to you last time, but the whole yin and yang thing is really in my head these days. This we have the most horrendous things happening and then the most beautiful things that are coming out of it right now. And how quickly things can flip potentially is also what I think that symbol tells us too. Anyway, it is always a pleasure to speak with you. It was also, I want to mention, I did speak with your mom last time when I was at that event. It's so cool to know that you're like a second generation rebel, if you will. I'm so pleased to know you, and I'm so pleased that you live in Calgary. It's all these things matter. All these conversations help us move forward. So I'm pleased to be in community with you, my comrade, if I may say. And
absolutely.
I hope to see you soon. And yeah, we'll keep the fight going.
Likewise, comrade. And thank you so much for having me on. It's my pleasure.
Thank you.